Fancy Dress by Robert Eastland, read by Roger Daltrey.
The fancy dress ball was in full swing when the Hunchback of Notre Dame first began to pirouette around the dance floor. Nobody noticed him, of course. Other more famous monsters were represented in the nightclub in their 3s and 4s. Frankenstein creations in flat heads and weighted boots, vampires with greased-back hair and chalk-white faces, and one particular ingenious Mr. Hyde, resplendent in dress suit, topper, cape, and indescribably ghoulish face paint. Add to that the various cavaliers, ladies of court, Roman centurions, witches, judges, redcoats, angels, and nylon-wearing nuns, and it was hardly surprising that Quasimodo made an insignificant figure. Especially as he hadn't seemed to have put in too much of an effort. What was an old parka turned inside out and stuffed with pillows, a latex horror mask, and baggy patched-up trousers, if not dismally cheap and amateurish. Even the absurd iron caliper on his right leg seemed odd and out of place, though it did ensure that he walked with an ungainly limp. Quasimodo was oblivious to all this, however. As midnight approached, he was enjoying himself immensely, cavorting over every inch of the dance floor, round and around, threading back and forth through the dense throng of exotic revelers, determined, it seemed, to move among every single group in the building. And with perhaps 500 crammed into the club, screaming and shouting and bopping drunkenly to the thumping rock music, that required energy and determination. The fact was that the Hunchback was quite proud of his costume. Unimpressive it may have been on the outside, but on the inside it was a virtual work of art. The hump, for example, may have looked like a huge and shapeless bundle of rags, but in actual fact, it concealed a 6-gallon drum of pure industrial alcohol, strapped to his back with a harness. The old trousers may have looked ragged and baggy and way too large for him. That was because they had to accommodate the length of rubber hosepipe, which coiled around his body from the base of the drum and ran down his right leg, where its nozzle was held to his ankle by the leg iron. And so far, it was all working perfectly. The Hunchback only had to put a hand in his right pocket to remove the crocodile clip from the hosepipe, and the inflammable liquid would gush out onto the nightclub floor whenever he wished it to. And oh, how he wished it to. There couldn't have been a place in that crowded nightclub where Quasimodo didn't dance that night. And everywhere he went, bar area, fast food restaurant, seating bays, balcony, game zone, lavatories, pool room, stairways, and dance floor, of course, slick, glistening pools were left behind him, either soaking black and silent into the old carpets or running in rivulets over shiny floorboards, where people slid in them but always assumed that it was the result of spilled drinks. The scheming Hunchback had done his homework well in other aspects too. Dark cave-like rooms and the odd burst of strobe lighting made visual detection a virtual impossibility. And in an atmosphere thick with dry ice, cigarette smoke and the raw stink of booze, those faint but telltale fumes were immediately lost. Quasimodo had never known such a feeling of power. As he capered back and forth through the teeming crowd, what joy! What revenge! The original plan had been to blunder in, the spirit running freely from his ankle, to drench as many areas as he could in the few minutes it would take for the tank to run dry, and then escape. The addition of the crocodile clip, however, had been a belated masterstroke. The ability to control the flow now made him a godlike being. Now he could punish those who most deserved punishing. The bouncers, for example, refusal to permit him entry to the club last Saturday had been a serious mistake. Now, wherever they stood, scowling at the crowd, he ensured a flood tide. The most beautiful girls and women, years of indifference to his comical blundering advances, would be paid back 100-fold. Limbering wildly around them as they stood in glamorous, giggling groups, gave him near orgasmic pleasure. The hooligans, with everyone in fancy dress, it was not as easy as usual to pick out these perennial villains of urban nightlife, but their swaggering walks and aggressive postures still made them recognizable. He gamboled joyously amongst them. Unlike his fictional counterpart, this Quasimodo was not a physical gargoyle, but in his soul he felt that he might as well have been. During the course of his life, he had suffered at the hands of most kinds of people, either directly or indirectly. It made no difference to him which. A New Year's Eve party like this seemed to offer a fair cross-section of them, though, so that made it okay to break off dancing for a while and walk carefully from one area to the next, trailing canals behind him. After all, he had to make sure that all of the goons were connected. It was actually quite fascinating to him how far a single gallon went, let alone 6. With only minutes to go until midnight, at least half a tank still sloshed about on his back, yet the hunchback could not think of a single place in the nightclub he had not visited. He had gone out of his way to leave the dance floor, in particular, swimming, because this was where most revelers would be congregated on the stroke of midnight. If nothing else went up, he thought, that would be enough. Anything else after that would be a bonus. At 2 minutes to 12, rather than push his luck too far, he decided that it was time to leave. So what if he had a few pints left? Pure alcohol was expensive after all. He stuck his hand into his pocket and replaced the crocodile clip. Then, nodding at all and sundry, his rubber face a perpetual deformed grimace, he pranced back across the club, then slipped quietly into the lavatory passage. The point of ignition had already been chosen. Quasimodo had been there earlier, and the spirit had now soaked nicely into the grotty carpet, linking the gents with the ladies. Congratulating himself on such astute thinking, he quickly took the cigarette and lighter from an inside pocket, lit up, smoked for a few seconds, and then stood the glowing dog end directly in front of the ladies. The sodden, sticky mass of the carpet held it upright nicely. At least, it would do, till some unlucky bimbo blundered in to powder her nose. Quasimodo walked quickly away to the main doors. Nobody noticed as he left. They wouldn't. The cashiers were counting up, the bouncers standing talking to the coat check girls. The club could only be seconds from combustion, and the urge to run was suddenly overwhelming. But he knew that he couldn't afford to do that. The big flare-up didn't come so quickly, however. Quasimodo had time to stop and gasp at the unexpected chill as he stepped out onto the forecourt. A severe frost had come down, freezing his sweat-soaked body, but he blundered on across the car park, then taking the path to his right, crossed the canal footbridge and found a place on the far bank amongst the trees to watch. He wasn't sure how much he'd be able to see. The nightclub was a redeveloped warehouse, and from outside looked exactly like that. Music and multicolored lights pumped out from the open skylights, however, and 2 fire escapes were visible from this side. The potential for a good show was definitely there. Minutes passed. Still the music throbbed from the gigantic building. Midnight came and went. He grew quickly impatient. Surely he hadn't spent so much money for nothing. People would be leaving soon, in droves. Suddenly, as if right on cue, the drunken singing descended into a chorus of terrified shrieks. It sounded as if all Bedlam was letting loose. The inane disco music was abruptly lost in the hysterical dirge. Quasimodo felt a wild surge of excitement. If only he could see it! The cacophony of screams rose and rose in volume. Now there was agony in them as well as fear. The hunchback began to caper gleefully about on the canal bank. He could imagine. He didn't have to imagine for long, though. Thick, foul smoke was soon belching up from the skylights, infernal red light shining beneath it. Somewhere glass exploded. Then he heard angry, frightened voices from the front doors to the club. A man was shouting something about getting the fire brigade. For God's sake, someone get the fire brigade. Oh, please, God, someone get the fire brigade. Oh, sweet Jesus, please. Then Quasimodo was bathed in a blinding light. He looked up, mesmerized. A door had crashed open at the top of the fire escape across the canal from him, and someone, it was not possible to tell who at the moment, it probably never would be, staggered out, blazing from head to foot, then fell heavily down the iron stairway. Through the open door, Quasimodo could see a turmoil of smoke and flames, the like of which he had never imagined. It had grown to colossal proportions almost immediately, probably thanks to all that glittering Christmas brocade. Even the ceiling and walls were on fire in there. The crackling of the flames sounded ferocious. Unbearable hot smoke was already drifting over the canal like noxious gas. He wondered how many had made it to the front doors and into the open air. Unable to resist a little peek, he tripped quietly back along the canal bank for a short distance and was stopped in his tracks by a sight which at first he found almost impossible to believe. For a narrow snake of fire had wound its way out of the nightclub doors, threaded a path through the legs of the staggering smoke-blackened revellers, and was now streaking across the footbridge, apparently in pursuit of him. For a stupefied second, Quasimodo stood watching it. The snake reached his side of the canal and abruptly turned right towards him. It was coming at quite a pace, blazing blue and orange. Even then, he was too stunned to immediately work out what was going on. Puzzled, he thrust his hand into his pocket. He found the crocodile clip. It was still in place, but its sharp teeth had partially bitten through the rubber pipe, leaving a ragged hole. Unnoticed in his sweat-soaked trousers, industrial alcohol had been leaking freely down his leg. With a wild scream, Quasimodo began to run along the canal bank, but the fire snake chased him furiously. He struggled with the harness clamping the canister to his back, but the heavy costume covered it thickly and was held in place by a series of stout buckles. It had been designed to survive a night of frenzied dancing after all. The hunchback staggered and gasped for breath as he blundered along. He could feel the heat of the hungry snake on the back of his legs. Involuntarily, he gave a loud wail of terror. There was only one thing for it, only one avenue of safety. Holding his nose, the fire snake snapping at his heels, Quasimodo launched himself out over the canal. He'd be all right, he told himself, as he flew through the frozen air. He was a strong swimmer, and the water hadn't had time to freeze yet. Then he crashed into it. For a second, it was like moving out of reality. He plunged deep into a black void of such shocking iciness that his heart was almost stunned into immobility. Mindless seconds followed, but the hunchback had always had a good sense of self-preservation, and he quickly began to kick his way to the surface. But then he couldn't. Try as he may, he couldn't. He wasn't getting anywhere. In fact, if anything, he was sinking even deeper into the frozen chasm. And then it occurred to him. The heavy costume, the metal canister on his back, and the leg iron. Oh, God! The leg iron. Muscles and joints tearing with effort, lungs bursting in his chest, he fought and kicked and struggled, but always he went further down into the darkness, as if dragged by some irresistible force. For all his valiant efforts, Quasimodo might as well have been made of stone.
Snaggletooth by Paul Finch. Read by Dennis Waterman.
When Daniel and his sister returned to the big house at the end of Woodedge Close, he was amazed to see that hardly any of the other properties were left. On one side, where 4 large semi-detached homes had once stood, wrought iron railings fenced off lush new parkland. On the other, a small industrial plant had appeared, complete with tinted windows and parking bays. At this late hour of the day, it was closed and deserted. Could so much really change in 30 years? He wondered aloud. They just couldn't sell them, Francis explained, pulling up on the drive. Eventually, the families living there flitted and the council was forced to buy up the land. Daniel nodded, but he was no longer listening. He climbed out of the car and gazed up at the building which for so many years had been his childhood home. At least this was unchanged. It was still perched on high ground overlooking the end of the close. It still had a steep front garden, stepped and filled with glorious flowers. It still had its big bay windows and the front door of heavy oak. "You've kept it nicely," he said. She walked stiffly up the drive and let herself in. "It hasn't been easy, since Mum and Dad died." There was a faint hint of accusation in her voice, and she allowed the words to hang in the air as she moved through into the hall and started turning lights on. Daniel followed her inside. The same brolly rack sat by the door, the same telephone table stood next to it, The same stained glass windows looked down on the staircase to the left. On the right, the same doors led off to the lounge and dining room. At the far end of the passage, he could see the kitchen. Gleaming new units and white tiles were visible. That had changed, he thought. But perhaps that was inevitable. 30 years, though. It seemed incredible that he'd been away for so long. In fact, he'd only been back in the house 10 seconds, and it already seemed that he'd never left. Frances came back down the corridor, unbuttoning her Mac. His older sister had certainly changed too. She was heavier set than he ever remembered, walked painfully, and had a full head of grey hair. She couldn't have been 50 yet, but like so many other people he knew, she'd aged prematurely. She gave him a gentle look as she hung her coat up, then went through into the kitchen and put the kettle on. That was the closest Daniel's sister ever came to a smile. She'd been renowned for it since childhood. He laughed to himself. Nothing had changed there then. He laid his bag down and walked in after her. "I'm sorry I didn't get to the funerals," he said. At first she made no reply, but couldn't hold back her disapproval indefinitely. "It's not as if you couldn't have." "I know, I'm sorry." There was an awkward silence between them as she made a pot of tea. "It must have been awful," he suddenly said. "Finding them both there like that, in the lounge, together." She shrugged and handed him a steaming mug. He wondered what their parents' note had said, which surprised her. "Well, what do you think it said?" she almost snapped. Daniel drank his tea in silence, then looked darkly out of the window into the sloping back garden. At its farthest point there was still a gap in the hedge, where an old footpath led down into the darkened morass of the valley. "He took everything from us, didn't he?" said bitterly. Francis looked round in surprise at him. "Who?" "Snaggletooth," he replied. His sister shook her head in resignation. "Danny, just don't start all that again, please, not now." She hobbled through to the lounge and sat down on the sofa. Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. "Still insisting he doesn't exist?" he wondered. "What if I told you that he once came into this house?" Francis tried not to look astonished. "Oh, yes," Daniel went on. "About 2 nights after he killed that girl walking her dog in the valley. Around midnight it was. I was in bed. He just came into my room. I can still see all that straggling hair, those crazy eyes, that god-awful tooth. I don't know why he didn't attack me. He just stood there, towering over me, grinning, for about a minute. Then he was gone." She looked hard at him, as if trying to work him out once and for all. "It never occurred to you that you might have been having a nightmare?" Daniel shook his head. "It wasn't a nightmare that murdered Brendan Richards the next week, was it? Or young Michael Bately the month after that? Oh, for God's sake, Danny, you've got to stop all this." She clambered quickly to her feet and stormed out. A few minutes later he heard a door slam somewhere upstairs. Daniel couldn't stop it, of course. He wouldn't stop it. It was why he'd come back to this house in the first place. How could he have forgotten that quite appalling Saturday afternoon in the sewer pipe, when he'd watched Snaggletooth slaughter his young friend Michael? It was burned into his memory. Everyone had always said to avoid that sewer pipe. It was used to bring effluent into the river and wasn't supposed to be a very safe place to play, which of course had made he and his friends want to explore as far up it as possible. If you crouched down low enough, it was easy to move along it, and the filthy stream of effluent was only ever ankle deep, if it was there at all. What they hadn't expected, though, was to venture up it one afternoon and find Snaggletooth waiting there. Icy sweat broke on Daniel's brow as he remembered it all. If only they'd listened to the policeman who'd been to school telling them all to stay out of the valley, because there'd been 2 horrible murders there. If only they'd paid any attention. Even 30 years later, Daniel could still feel himself crushed up into a ball of abject terror, the stinking water flowing over him full of fresh blood. He could hear the gibbering screams coming down the pipe towards him. He could see the big hands around Michael's throat, the twisted yellow tooth as it slashed and tore at his face, the frenzy of hair as the abominable, indescribable thing tossed its head in ecstasy. When he looked up again at the sombre furnishings of the lounge, his cheeks were sodden with tears. Why the hell hadn't anyone believed him? Why hadn't they gone and got hold of the monster? For all anyone knew, it was still down there in the valley. Not that it would be for much longer. As he'd repeatedly told himself on the long journey home, he wasn't coming all the way back here for nothing. Daniel went out into the hall, knelt down and unzipped his bag. From under the few dog-eared paperbacks and bits of clothing, he took out his most prized possession, a gleaming, sawn-off shotgun, 12-bore, double-barreled and with a special cut-down stock for greater manoeuvrability and concealment. The circles he'd moved in over the last few years had been beneficial to him in more ways than one. With a chuckle, he broke the gun open and inserted 2 cartridges. A gasp of fright came down the stairs. He looked up sharply and found Frances standing there in her dressing gown. Her lined face was waxy white. Her hands clawed on the stair rail. What in the name of God is that? Daniel returned her gaze boldly, slammed the breech closed and shoveled a few more handfuls of cartridges into his jacket pockets before standing up. None of you believe me. None of you. Not even you, Fran. Well, we're going to do it the hard way. I'm going to go down the valley and get Snaggletooth myself. I suppose it should be down to me after everything that's happened to our family. For God's sake, Danny, she cried out. But he ignored her and moved through into the kitchen. She hobbled down the stairs and went after him as quickly as she could. Snaggletooth does not exist. You know that, Danny, you know that. Without a backward glance, he let himself out into the rear garden through the kitchen door. The misty gloom of a late summer night had now descended in full, and the air was dank and reeked of sap. Daniel strode quickly down the garden to the gap in the hedge, Frances struggling after him, pleading for reason. When he reached the hedge, he stopped and turned. She came breathlessly up to him, eyes wet with tears. "Danny, this is madness," she stammered. "Do you know what the police will do if they find you wandering around the valley with a weapon like that?" "The police," he scoffed. "A lot of good they were when we needed them most." "Danny, Snaggletooth is a fantasy," she asserted, grabbing his arm. "An illusion. You surely realise that by now." Angrily, he pulled away and cut through the cleft in the hedge, descending into the valley through the dense hawthorn brakes. "Are you telling me I didn't know what I saw?" he growled. She clapped a hand to her face. "Danny, you didn't know what was going on because you were just a child. For God's sake, must I spell it out? Where do you think you've been for the last 30 years? His expression betrayed sullen disappointment. "And after all this time, you still don't believe I was innocent?" She shook her head sadly. "I believe that you didn't know what you were doing. Everyone was prepared to accept that. But, Danny, the evidence was overwhelming. You came out of that sewer pipe drenched in blood. Heaven, it was even in your mouth. When they searched the house, they found the dog's lead in your bedroom. It was the one missing from the scene of that girl's murder." Daniel shook his head violently. "But, Frances, I didn't know how it got there. I don't. She threw her arms around him to calm him. I know, my darling. That's why they sent you to hospital rather than to prison." For a moment she spoke soothingly to him, like a mother, insisting that it was all over now, that it was all behind him, that it hadn't been his fault, that he'd been forgiven, that he'd paid his dues, that after years of rehabilitation, they'd decided he was fit to return to society. But it was only under license, of course, and strictly under his sister's supervision. She pecked him tenderly on the cheek, then stepped back. You have to realize, darling, that things can't be like they were before. Not just yet. You'll have to stay indoors most of the time, and the police will be checking on you regularly. The only reason they let you come back to our house was because we're now the only ones living in the close. Now, please, come on. It's for the best. It really is. After a thoughtful moment, he nodded and smiled. She smiled sadly back. But not for long. For as he looked at her, there was suddenly a subtle change in Daniel's eyes. A chill ran down Frances's spine. Her brother's face had now gone as hard as rock. Without a word, he lifted the shotgun to his shoulder, pointing it directly at his sister. Her eyes widened in disbelief as he slowly, deliberately cocked both barrels. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Danny!" The first payload took her in the chest, flinging her back against the tree trunk with shocking force. The second in the head, smashing it to bone and jellied brains. As the smoke cleared, she slithered slowly to the forest floor. Daniel gazed down at her for a moment, then fell to one knee and began to grope about in the glistening, pulpy mess. After a minute, he found the piece of evidence he was looking for and held it up in the moonlight. It was long, twisted, and sharp. He shook his head in stunned bewilderment. No wonder nobody ever saw you smile, Fran.
Enemy Hours by Paul Finch, read by Lisa Goddard.
The water was high and grey, the wind whipping salt spray in their faces. "Which island is it?" shouted Michelle. Kurt looked back towards her, his blonde beard dripping. "I don't know," he said, in his near-perfect English. He pulled up the hood of his waterproof. "It could be any one of half a dozen. Without the maps, I'm lost." Before them, a rocky mass loomed black on the cloudy skyline, waves bursting on it. On its furthest side, over another rolling desert of foam, the gloomy crags of the Isle of Lewis were faintly visible, but too far out of reach for the small motor chugging bravely at their rear. Andy was on the tiller bar, struggling to maintain their course, but the sound of Shiant was an awesome foe for any kind of vessel, and the rubberized three-man dinghy was flung about on it like chaff. "Keep your eyes peeled for a landing bay," he shouted to the other two, his voice hoarse. "We've no fuel left. We'll have to take the first chance we get." Michelle nodded and gazed starboard, holding tightly to the safety handle on the gunwale. The island's outer shoals were now visible, their jagged teeth poking up through the surf. Something like that had fingered the cabin cruiser, some massive pinnacle of rock just hidden under the surface. The awful thunder of splintering wood as it gouged a fatal wound in the keel would probably haunt her for the rest of her days. For a moment then, as they listed precariously over, a raging sea rising up on every side, she imagined that that was it. Game, set and match. Thank heaven Andy had packed the dinghy. Not that even he'd expected to have to use it. He'd been on at least 20 offshore protests and had never known anything happen like that. There was no way to play down the seriousness of it. Even if they all got back okay, it would take some explaining losing a 30-foot cabin cruiser, not to mention all that expensive monitoring equipment. Kurt was now looking at his compass. They rounded the first headland, and he glanced over his shoulder. "We're still following the pipeline," he shouted. "I don't know what this island's called, but I think the oil company has an observation post on it. They should have a radio." Michelle nodded her understanding. It was all very well worrying about the financial loss, but at the end of the day, the organisation was worldwide and could easily afford it. More important was to call in quickly and let everyone know that they were safe and well. A massive air and sea search by the authorities, who were not particularly sympathetic to them, never mind the press, who actively hated them, and all carried out for nothing, would be hideously bad publicity. And that was something the organisation could not afford. "Beach!" Andy suddenly shouted. As one, they looked to their left, where a gentle slope of sand and shells rose up through the tumbling surf. Beyond it, they saw dunes crowned with marram grass, and further on still, steep green hills littered with boulders. Michelle clapped a mittened hand to her face. Tears of relief mingled with the sea spray. Andy brought the dinghy into the beach in a tight curve, constantly buffeted by breakers. They hung on desperately, sodden to the skin, and the second they felt shingle crunch beneath them, leapt out and plunged shoreward, hauling the little boat after them. The beach was strewn with weed and driftwood, but Michelle could have flopped down and kissed it all. Behind them, the sea was a cauldron, boiling and frothing and rising up in mountains. The grey miasma of a typical Hebridean squall drifted slowly over it towards them. A few minutes more, and they might never have made it. Michelle could not imagine anything worse than plunging down through those deep and echoing chasms, the rumble of waves far above, only black shadows and chill silence below. She fell forward onto her knees, only for Kurt to help her up again. The young German was of strong, athletic build, and a veteran of many an arduous protest, not only here, but in the Baltic, the North Sea, and even off the coast of Nova Scotia. At times like this, he was a good person to have around. "I suggest we find the oil company's installation," he said with a broad grin. "If nothing else, they should have hot coffee, blankets." Michelle nodded weakly and turned back to Andy, who was busy deflating the dinghy. He'd already lost over 50 grand's worth of gear. He didn't want to add to it. They ploughed along the beach for 10 minutes or so, huddled in their waterproofs, before they saw the first signs of habitation. A clutch of buildings on the next headland. They were small, square and built of whitewashed concrete. Various antennae and satellite dishes were fixed on their flat roofs. Windows looked out over the sea, but there were no lights in them. "Company digs for sure," said Kurt. "Shall we go in?" Michelle nodded tiredly, but Andy hung back. He was a surly young Londoner, deeply committed and outspoken, but inclined to pessimism. "We're sure they'll welcome us," he wondered. Kurt shrugged. "Hey, we need to find out." Then a sheet of icy rain swept over them, and Michelle cried out, "For God's sake, Andy, why do you have to make a confrontation out of everything? You know these guys are usually reasonable. They know it's nothing personal." Andy snorted. "Well, I'm glad they know it. I wish I did. I happen to live on this planet they're screwing around with." He strode past them towards the buildings. "And so do you!" he shouted back. Michelle gave Kurt a defeated look. He smiled, put an arm around her shoulders, and hurried after Andy. The company installation sat on a platform which had been cut into the natural rocks of the coastline. It overlooked a small bay, a gravel path snaking down from it to a wooden boardwalk and jetty, where a small motorboat was tied up, riding high on the swell. There was nobody at home, however. No voice replied to their repeated knocks, so they walked around its exterior, glancing in through the windows, but seeing only darkness. The rain still swept across them, and Michelle was shivering hard. "Maybe it's disused," she said. "I doubt it," replied Kurt. "They've nowhere near finished the pipeline yet." "Probably just sleeping on the job," snorted Andy. Around the next corner, however, they found another door, and this one was hanging open. "Hello!" Kurt shouted through it. "Is anybody here? Hello? Our boat has been damaged. Can you help us? Hello?" Still, there was no reply. They exchanged bemused glances, before Kurt finally shrugged and stepped inside. Michelle followed, Andy bringing up the rear. The place was a shambles. They found 3 separate rooms in that first building. An observation room, facing onto the jetty and the sea, an operations room, packed with high-tech tracking and radio equipment, and living quarters with 3 bunks, a kitchen area, and toilet and shower facilities. All, however, had been ransacked. Machinery smashed, its innards hanging out in strips of shredded cable and broken circuit board. The floor strewn with the remains of documents, all cut into tiny pieces as if by some maniac with a pair of scissors. Even the living area had been systematically destroyed. The bedding slashed into tatters, the mattresses gutted, every cupboard door in the kitchen ripped from its hinges, the shelves pulled out, strewing broken crockery. There was one large closet, and this also stood open. The windbreakers and cagoules which had once hung inside it were now all heaped on its floor, also rent and torn into rags. They walked back and forth through the carnage for several minutes before anyone could summon the courage to speak. It was Michelle. "My God," she whispered. "They'll say we've done this," Andy remarked. "They'll come back right now, find us here, and say we've done it." The girl looked round at the 2 men, wide-eyed. But where are they? Surely they wouldn't leave the place totally unmanned. Kurt could only shrug. A little later, he and Michelle went to explore the rest of the base. There were 2 additional buildings, one a storehouse, the other a generator room. The equipment in there was undamaged and in working order, but had run down through lack of fuel. Back in the observation area, they found Andy gazing out through the rain-spattered windows. "The radio's gone west with everything else," he said gloomily. "Looks like we're back to square one." There was a minute of brooding silence. Aside from having their feet on firm ground and a roof over their heads, they hadn't made exceptional progress. There might be food and water stocks in the place, but it was anyone's guess what condition they'd be in. And as far as the rest of the world was still concerned, all 3 of them were at the bottom of the sea. "Notice the smell?" Michelle suddenly said, looking up and wrinkling her nose. They sampled the air. Now that she mentioned it, there was a rather unpleasant odour, sort of dank and fishy, and present in every room. It made the girl think of dark sea caves and sodden wrecks in hidden coves. Breathing it in too deeply was quite noxious. "It won't be much fun spending the night here," Kurt observed. "Or the next 6 months," Andy added. They exchanged haggard looks. He was right. "There might be something we can do," Kurt suddenly said, and he hurried out to the storehouse. When he came back, he was carrying a small can of petrol, and he quickly outlined his plan. It was a long shot, but there was nothing to lose trying it. They'd come halfway round the island trying to find a landing bay. Any boats or choppers sweeping the area where the cruiser had gone down would not even see them. If he walked to the other side, however, and lit a good-sized fire on the shore, keeping it going for as long as he could, he might attract some attention. 5 minutes later he'd set off, petrol in hand. He just hoped he could find enough driftwood, he told them cheerfully, as he trudged up the beach. Andy and Michelle watched in silence until his brightly coloured waterproofs vanished over the next headland. There was no reason for them all to have gone. The rain was still blowing in off the sea, and in any case someone had to stay put just in case help did turn up. "I wonder what happened here," said Michelle. Andy grunted and moved back through into the living quarters. He bent down and picked up what looked like an old torn map. "Nothing they probably hadn't been asking for," he said. "Carving this dump out on an unspoiled island. How long's it going to go on for, eh? How bloody long? Till the whole world's under concrete?" Michelle came to the doorway. "We don't even know where we are yet, do we?" "Might as well have a look before it gets too dark," he replied, starting to piece the map together. It showed a wide spread of the Outer Hebrides. He glanced up at her. "Why don't you see if you can get that portable stove from the storehouse going? Make us all a cup of tea, eh?" Michelle glared at him in disbelief for a moment before storming out. "Up yours," she snapped. It only took Kurt 20 minutes to circle round to the other side of the island. All along the beach, on the higher, steeper dunes, he saw odd formations of holes, like the burrows of small animals. Hundreds upon hundreds of them, running in long parallel lines to the water's edge. Being a conservationist by nature, he'd loved to have hung around, quietly observing and trying to find out what had made the holes, and indeed might still live there, but he knew he didn't have the time. It was the first sign of animal life he'd so far seen on the island, though. It was only September, and ordinarily he'd have expected to find the place alive with the cries of cormorant and curlew, not to mention gulls. He listened as he walked, but only the dull roar of the sea came back to him, the sighing of wind in the dry, tussocky grass. Even as Scottish islands went, it was not a very friendly place. Over the next headland he came down a steep slope into a narrow cove strewn with pebbles and wide, flat boulders. Kurt was halfway down when he suddenly stopped in his tracks. By the water's edge, some brightly coloured shape was drifting about in the backwash. Warily he made his way towards it. It was luminous green in colour, trimmed with crimson, and seemed to be expanding as he approached it. The stench of salt was almost overpowering, along with something else, the stench of fish. Then it struck Kurt what the object was. A cagoule or anorak, weighed down in the water but spreading on the tide. At that same instant, he noticed the red smears at his feet. Glistening red smears, which meandered over the pebbles towards the sea, as if something had been dragged. The German glanced at the cagoule again. The waves swirled crimson around it. That was when he heard the grating sound behind him, the unmistakable shifting and toppling of wide, flat boulders. Back at the installation, Michelle was still fuming. She was standing alone on the jetty, gazing out over the waves. A cold sea mist was now hemming them in on all sides, but she ignored it. She'd never counted herself an ardent feminist, but would not be ordered around like a skivvy. Andy was such a prat, one of those deep-thinking male socialists who liked to put it all away when he got home at night. Then she wondered what was moving under the jetty. She glanced down, surprised. Some large object was bobbing about under her feet, slapping against the struts. She tried to look between the planks, but it was too dark. It hardly mattered. She assumed it would be a coracle or a buoy or some such thing. Then it floated into view. It was face down, its arms and legs splayed out wide, strands of grey hair rippling around its head. Michelle was frozen with shock, her mouth fixed open. Seconds seemed to pass before she could respond. Behind her, a boat hook was propped up against one of the mooring pillars. She seized it and reached down, grappling the body under the hood of its parka. She swallowed hard, preparing for the worst, then drew it in close and managed to heave it over. The eyes were empty sockets in blue-white pulp, the mouth a yawning cavern filled with brackish water. That wasn't the worst of it, though. For whoever it was, he had been gutted. Before she staggered helplessly away, vomiting, Michelle caught mad, fleeting glimpses of a ripped-open coat and sweater, and beneath that an opened belly, black and stinking and empty. Empty except for something which had no business in there, something hard and brown and shiny and moving sluggishly around. Before she knew what she was doing, Michelle was pounding back up the path, shrieking hysterically. It took Andy several minutes to calm her sufficiently to get an explanation, and when he went down to the jetty himself, the body had turned over again and drifted out of reach. Michelle appeared behind him, shivering violently. We've got to get out of here, she stammered. Andy nodded. He was shaken, but unlike the girl, had seen death at sea before and was not badly fazed by it. "I'll go and get Kurt first," he said. She seized his arm, incredulous, her fingers digging into the flesh. "You're not leaving me here?" He pulled free and walked off the jetty. "You'll be safer here. It looks like there's another storm coming." "You're not leaving me here," she insisted, running after him. Oh, Christ, Michelle! He shouted, rounding angrily on her, so that she shrank back from him. You'll be perfectly all right, he assured her in a more level voice. I'm just going to try and find Kurt before he wastes all that petrol. We can use it for the motorboat. That bloke probably just drowned. The fish'll have had a go at him. That sort of made sense, she supposed, still shaking. She'd heard about things like that before. She tried to speak again, but he put a finger to her lips. You have to stay here, love. Someone might turn up and check. And believe me, we can't afford to miss them. That also made sense. And so off he went, sauntering away along the beach, leaving Michelle there, alone. A moment later, she went back to the installation. She felt very cold and very tired as she stood there in the observation room, hugging herself. At length, she looked up at the sky and wondered what time it was. It must be mid-afternoon at least. She'd been up since the crack of dawn. So she went through into the wrecked bedroom and lay down on one of the bunks. She wondered which had been the dead man's. This one, perhaps? It hardly mattered. He wasn't going to need it now. As she drifted into exhausted sleep, however, she began to wonder about that. Began to wonder if those were his dragging, squelching footsteps she could hear on the stone path outside. If it was him she could hear shuffling through the rubble of paper in the next room, or standing in the doorway, dripping, reeking of fish. She came awake sharply and looked at the door. It was still empty, afternoon light spilling through. The smell of fish was very pungent, however, more so than before. Michelle sat slowly up. What was that faint tapping she could hear from the next room? That scratching and scrabbling sound? She felt her hair start to prickle. It was like long fingernails or hard, wet claws drumming on the tabletops. Hard, wet, chitinous claws. Then she heard something inside the room with her, a faint slithering. Now, petrified, Michelle turned her head. Directly opposite, the closet door was still ajar. There was a movement inside, though. The heap of coats and boots was shifting slightly, vibrating. Items were slowly being dislodged, as if something was trying to dig its way out. She watched in disbelief as one after another the garments fell away. The heap was now shaking violently. An oilskin hat tumbled down from the top, the coat beneath sliding after it. And Michelle saw an eye, peering unblinkingly at her from the midst of a grey face. A grey, wounded face, repeatedly slashed and streaked with blood. By sheer instinct alone, she bolted to the door and out through the observation room, not looking once at anything which might be in there. Scrambling down to the beach, legs pumping till they ached. She ran blindly for minutes on end, the blood pounding in her ears, tears glazing her vision. In front, the footprints of the two men seemed to trail endlessly on towards the next headland, but she never once slowed, never once looked round. At last, however, at long last, her figure appeared in front of her on the skyline. Michelle cried out in joyous relief and fell to her knees, gasping. Then the tears came properly, hot and fast, welling out. She uttered prayers of thanks to a God she hadn't believed in since she was a little girl, and looked gratefully up again. The figure was clearly Andy. She could tell that by the stocky shape of him. But he seemed to be having trouble. He was reeling about, grabbing at his head and back. Michelle's tears dried as she watched. Slowly, it dawned on her that she could hear distant screams. She wondered why the ground seemed to be moving around his feet, why he seemed to be cluttered all over with objects on his back, his arms, his head. Then a terrifying truth occurred to Michelle. She backed away. No, she whispered. She thought of everything they had found on the island, everything slashed and torn as if by scissors. A strong smell of fish and dank sea caves. The scrabbling of hard, wet, chitinous claws. 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 Dear God. She turned frantically. But they were watching her. In their tens of thousands. On the higher dunes. Coming out of the sandholes, one after another, in that chilling sideways motion. Their hard brown shells gleaming in the pale light. Their claws extended. Dark-tipped. Razor-edged. No, Michelle said again, almost gibbering. You don't understand. We're not like the others. A single wave, the vast multitude began scuttling towards her. Now she screamed. We're on your side. That's what we do. It's why we came here. Please! Her cry for mercy fell only on the emptiness of nature, however. And unlike man, nature cannot discriminate.
Creatures of the Night by Robert Eastland, read by Honor Blackman.
It was somewhere around midnight when Cathy decided that she'd made a big mistake letting Michael camp out with his friends. She sat bolt upright in bed, wondering what on earth had possessed her. All right, there were 3 of them, and Maybury Park was only round the corner. But they were only 11 years old, and it suddenly seemed horribly quiet out there. She crossed the bedroom, pulled the drapes aside, and looked out of the window. Oh, how deserted the town was at this hour. Absolutely nothing moved. The yellow glow of the street lamps seemed to create more dark spaces than light ones. In gardens, under trees, in the many narrow alleyways linking one street to the next. Even the cars were immovable objects, sleek and gleaming, but full to their brims with blackness and rooted to the curbs. Drawn curtains on the windows of the neighbours' houses cut them off too, the beings inside lost in their voids of sleep, utterly unreachable. The stillness of it all was tangible. Cathy imagined you could draw a knife through it and hear its fabric ripping. And then, of course, there was the silence. It covered everything like a quilt. For a moment, Cathy dithered by her curtain. Michael would probably sulk for days, not so much because he'd been suddenly denied a night's camping out, but because of the humiliation in the eyes of his school friends. She wondered what Bill would have said had he still been living at home. Probably something macho and empty-headed like, "This is the sort of thing lads of his age get up to," or, "When I was a lad, we used to go camping in the Brecon Beacons, never mind the town park." She could just picture him as he said it, slouched in front of the TV, beer in one hand, a doorstep-thick cheese sandwich in the other, his eyes fixed on the screen. That decided her on the matter. She whipped her nightie off, climbed into her jeans, and pulled on a sweatshirt and an old pair of pumps. Anything her ex-husband thought okay was definitely a big no-no. That path had always led to disaster. It was a dry, clear night, but cool for September, so she put on her mac and scarf before venturing outside. When she stepped from the porch, however, she was still having second thoughts. Not so much now for her young son's safety, but for her own. Since the divorce 2 years ago, she'd hardly ever been out at night, except at weekends, when the town was alive with revellers, and even then in the company of friends. A midweek night like this suddenly seemed very lonely. More to the point, the house she and Michael lived in was large and detached, with extensive gardens around it. Access to Ashwood Lane was via the drive, which ran for 20 yards through trees and bushes. At this time of night, they were a formless, leafy mass, offering many a dark place for any would-be attacker to hide in. Cathy hung back. She could always get the car out of the garage, she supposed, but it hardly seemed worth it with the park only 5 minutes' walk away. After a moment, she steeled herself and went boldly down to the road. This was a pretty safe neighbourhood. It was an official home watch area, and they were a long way from the town centre where the most dangerous hooligans tended to hang out. For a main trunk road, however, Ashwood Lane was unnervingly quiet. It ran off into the far distance in either direction, bereft of cars or pedestrians. She stood at the bottom of the drive for a moment, gazing along the lane to a distant junction controlled by traffic lights. They changed, steadily and repeatedly. Monotonous, serving nobody. Spooky, that. She turned and began to walk the other way, coming quickly to the corner of Maybury Close. The park was down at the far end of it. Cathy jammed her hands into her Mac pockets and glanced over her shoulder before setting off down towards it, and was forcibly stopped in her tracks. Her heart missed a beat. Just for a moment then, way down Ashwood Lane, she fancied she'd seen the figure of a man stepping quickly into someone's driveway. Cathy stood there trembling. Had she or hadn't she? There was certainly no sign of anyone now, but then there wouldn't be if he'd just ducked out of sight. Cathy carried on swiftly down Maybury Close, a little disconcerted. There'd be nothing in it, whoever he was. He was probably just going home. Ducked out of sight, indeed. More likely he'd just been entering his own driveway. Not that that explained the odd look of the man. Cathy tried to tell herself that she'd only caught a momentary glimpse of him, but she'd still been given the impression of a very long coat, almost ankle length in fact, a briefcase, and thick straggling hair hanging down over his back and shoulders. There'd also been a beard, she thought, a dark, unkempt beard. Cathy was certain of one thing. She knew nobody in this neighbourhood who looked like that. Still, it wasn't worth dwelling on. She looked over her shoulder again all the same. She saw nobody else and heard nothing more until she reached the bottom end of Maybury Close and walked over to the park. A dull, distant light was flickering far out in its pitch-black depths. Michael and his friend's tent. Maybury Park wasn't a park as such, more an open green space between housing estates, planted with elm trees and the odd flower bed. When Michael had first told her the plan, she'd never considered that there could be any danger there. They'd be surrounded by houses, after all. But at this time of night, they seemed a long way from anyone. The light was a pinpoint in the shadows. Cathy walked more quickly towards it. The grass was already soaked with dew and littered with early leaves. Cathy realized that her breath was smoking. Then she wondered why she was rushing. Even when the tent's triangular shape came into view, she felt panic. The light was on inside it, but it threw no shadows on the canvas. There were no sounds of horseplay either, or boyish laughter. Cathy found herself running. In front of the tent, she could now see a litter of crisp bags and empty pop bottles. Without a word, but panting hard, she ripped the flap back and stuck her head inside. All three of them were in there, curled up in their sleeping bags. Her sudden intrusion brought them awake with loud cries of fright, however, then groans of disbelief. "Michael," she said firmly, "come on, please, we're going." He was about to protest, but she gave him her hardest look, and sullenly he began to get his stuff together. Cathy was surprised at the ease of her victory. She'd expected at least some resistance. As it was, he was now pulling on his anorak and hiking boots and rolling his bits and pieces up in his sleeping bag. The other two boys watched him in silence, pop-eyed with sleep, faces chalk white and sickly from the unaccustomed exposure to the night air. Only when she closed the flap on them did they begin to talk together, a furtive, mumbled conversation. "Thanks, Mum," said Michael, stumping off ahead of her. "I knew this would happen." But he still didn't put up the real fight he was capable of. As she followed him, Cathy thought she knew why. She glanced around. The trees were black stanchions silhouetted against the distant glow of the streetlights. Here, under the elms, the shadows were thick and bottomless, and made it difficult to see your own hand in front of your face. It was easy to think you'd be brave in the daylight hours. Things changed at night, of course. Unwittingly, she'd given him the excuse he'd been looking for. Then a flicker of movement caught her eye. She stopped sharply, grabbing Michael by the shoulder. He winced and pulled away and was about to say something when he saw her expression. She was staring hard to her left, eyes straining to penetrate the dark. "What?" he asked, rubbing his shoulder melodramatically. "Nothing," she said after a moment in a tight voice. "Let's get on. It's very late." She was damned if she was going to tell him she thought she'd just seen someone ducking out of sight behind one of the tree trunks. Fleetingly, the thought struck her that now it was wrong to leave the other two lads behind. But her motherly instincts were working full tilt. Getting Michael to home and safety first was a priority. She felt the urge to put an arm around his shoulders as they walked, but knew he'd shrug it off. They reached the pavement without incident and struck off along it, but Cathy could sense that vast, lightless space of parkland behind them, and the echoes of their footfalls seemed horribly loud. So loud, in fact, that they'd surely never hear someone creeping up on them. "Soon be home now," Cathy said. Michael grunted, as if that was all he needed. It was only a 5-minute walk away, but Cathy was now thinking about the numerous drives and gates they had to pass first, about the numerous parked cars and vans with the unseen niches between them, about the numerous low walls overhung with densely leafed branches. How little light the sodium yellow lamps actually gave off when it came down to it, she realized. They were halfway up Maybury Close when there was a sudden, violent crash from somewhere behind them. Both jumped, and despite herself, Cathy looked round. She half hoped to see someone locking their car in a garage, or putting the cat out of the side door. There was nobody there, however, and no telltale lights, either outside or inside any of the houses. "Almost there," she told Michael, hoping he wouldn't notice the shake in her voice. Then, in the corner of her eye, she saw a face, waiting just around the side of a house, watching them with a horrible expression. Cathy drew air in through clenched teeth. She tried not to scream, and in that same instant realized that it was only a garden statuette, a cherub dancing in the middle of someone's back lawn, now framed in an open side gate. It leered out at them as they passed. "Why'd you come and get me?" Michael suddenly asked. "The others' mums aren't bothered?" "I just had second thoughts, that's all," Cathy replied. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "There's no one else about, you know. I'm certain we'd be all right." He spoke in an irritable, patronizing tone. They said nothing else to each other for a minute or so, and came to the corner with Ashwood Lane, where Cathy slowed down and stopped. Michael looked up at her questioningly. "We waiting for a bus or something?" he asked cheekily. "Just a minute," she said sharply. She moved to the corner and looked round it. As before, the road was deserted, the ever-changing traffic light a sentinel shape at the far end. Their own drive was only 50 or so yards along, but now they were close to where she'd thought she'd seen that weird, bearded guy. Cathy realized that all along, this was what she'd most feared, getting back to the house. Whatever the atmospheric effects and figments of her own imagination had contrived to do to her on the way to and from Maybury Park, getting back to Ashwood Lane was never going to have provided comfort, because she knew for a fact that there really was someone hanging around there. But where the hell was he now? Still down the far end? Or hiding somewhere a little closer? She looked back along the road. It was still bare of life. The entrance to their own drive was tantalizingly close. their own drive, with all those bushes and trees along it. That would be an ordeal in itself. "There's nothing here," he told her loudly. Now there was a note of real aggravation in his voice. "Why don't we just go home?" She still made no reply, and with a sigh of annoyance, he set off on his own. "Michael!" He started violently and turned quickly round. She took him by the arm and led him back to the street corner. "Listen, darling," she said quietly. I think there is someone." And then she told him. She told him all about the strange figure in the long coat, about the thick beard and wild frenzy of hair, about the way he was loitering and clearly didn't want to be seen. To her surprise, however, Michael didn't look even remotely afraid. He stared at her as if she was an idiot. "That's Dr. Smelly," he said after a moment. "Dr. Smelly?" Cathy was baffled. Michael nodded. "Oh, he's a sort of tramp. He's always hanging around. Surely even you've heard of him." Cathy shook her head. Michael looked up to heaven in disbelief. "Where have you been? He walks around every night." "Who exactly is he?" From what she'd so far heard, she didn't exactly approve, but she still felt a little better. Putting a name and a face to the unknown entity was always reassuring. She began to edge her way along the street. "They said he used to be a doctor down at the infirmary," Michael explained, tagging along. "You know, a surgeon. They say someone died while he was operating on them, and he went bonkers. He's been walking about ever since. Everyone says that he's trying to work up the courage to do another operation. He's supposed to carry all his equipment round in that case with him. He's all right, though. He looks scary, but a few of us have even spoken to him. People should want to help him, not run away from him." They'd now reached the drive entrance, and Cathy looked up at it. It would have helped, she realised, if she'd put the outside lights on. Darkness hung over the porch like canvas. Michael marched straight up, however, and warily she followed. She didn't dare look sideways, but could easily picture a ragged, long-haired figure standing there under the trees, a coat buttoned down to his ankles, the leaves and twigs rustling as he shuffled slowly towards her, now dappled with silver streaks of moonlight which revealed dank, lice-infested hair, and the face of a maniac, eyes livid, teeth bared, shuffling towards her. No, floating, ghost-like, not making a sound, right up behind her, hair rippling around his head like serpents. Cathy came up against the front door, sweating hard. She turned the key quickly and opened up. Michael walked jauntily in. She looked back. The drive was now deserted, and she'd of course known it would be. She shook her head at the curse of her own vivid imagination and locked up behind her. A few minutes later, they were upstairs and getting ready for bed. Michael switched his tape deck on, but Cathy shouted through the bedroom wall to turn it off. It was way too late at night. Grudgingly, she imagined, he did. Shortly afterwards, she heard him going into the bathroom. Then the tap came on. Thankfully, she stripped off and climbed into bed. The duvet, having been left rolled back for the last 20 minutes, had aired itself nicely and was deliciously soft and warm. It didn't seem quite so frightening out there now, she reflected, switching off her bedside light and snuggling down. Not now that she'd been out and experienced it for herself. It was just another town at midnight. Nobody around, everything at peace. It made a healthy change, let's face it. Cathy felt sleep stealing over her in that old, luxurious way. She moaned softly to herself. Next door, Michael turned over in bed, the springs creaking. But no, that had to be wrong. Surely she could still hear him in the bathroom, washing his hands. It was a real scrub-up, too, by the sounds of it. What was he trying to do? She wondered dreamily. Sterilize them?
Moving by Robert Eastland, read by Julian Clary.
Why should I have moved? I didn't want to move. They had no right to ask me to move. At first, I thought they were joking when they offered me a new council house in a different part of town. I didn't want to live in a different part of town, I told them. I didn't care that this council project was condemned. It was my home. It had been for years. They weren't unpleasant about it, the people from the council, not at first anyway. They couldn't believe that I liked living on Marlborough Court. Surely I'd have been glad to get out to the suburbs. Nearly all the other residents had signed without a second thought. I have to admit that Marlborough Court was not everything its designers had envisaged. The 8-storey tenements had been built in the 60s, part of the great architectural dream to restore the decayed neighbourhoods and accommodate everyone in a decent new housing. Each project was built in a horseshoe shape, with a sort of courtyard in the middle, complete with parking and kiddies' play equipment. On each one, a great Gothic archway provided access to the outside world. It must have looked impressive on the drawing board. But that was an old story. By the time they asked me to move, rubbish and burned-out cars littered the courtyard. Most of the units were empty, and graffiti ran riot over the doors and boarded windows. It was a nightmare. But it was still my home. I am a single man, and I kept myself to myself. I lived with a little spaniel called Poppy, and the two of us found Marlborough Court an ideal sanctuary to be tucked away in. Nobody bothered us, and we bothered nobody else. Eventually, of course, the council people got a bit bored with all this, and said that if I wouldn't accept any other house or flat, they'd have to evict. The whole estate was being bulldozed for a brand new intersection to ease traffic congestion on the city's chaotic road network. It was vital for the community of the city as a whole, and one selfish man was not going to stop it. I was still determined to stay. I would fight them, I said. I found out that one other resident had the same idea, a Mr. Mulqueeny, who lived on the ground floor opposite. He was an OAP and a former Grenadier Guard. Things might have been easier for me in this respect. Mr. Mulqueeny didn't like me much, and even though I went to see him several times with legal documents and such, he sat grumpily in his chair, arms folded, speaking only tersely, and never offered me a cup of tea. Our relationship ended completely a few days after the last of the other residents moved out. By this time, I think I was really irritating Mr. Mulqueeny, and when I went down to see him with some petition forms and took Poppy with me because it was time for her walk, he finally swore at me and told me to get the damn brute out of his house. He'd had enough, he shouted. After that, I felt very lonely. I was 3 stories up and found Marlborough Court a big, echoing canyon. Entire days passed without me ever seeing anyone. I stood on the balcony outside my front door, looking down into the courtyard, where litter was blowing about like tumbleweed, and not hearing a single sound. Yet there we were, in the heart of a thriving city. All that was to change the next night, however, when someone started to kick a football against my front door. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then I woke up properly and lay there, rigid, cuddling Poppy. It came as a repeated heavy thump, every half-minute or so. I knew it was a football because I could hear it bouncing about on the concrete after each impact. Then the sound of feet scampering about, trying to get it under control again. I didn't dare look out and lay there for several hours after it had stopped, unable to sleep. I was so afraid. Then it occurred to me that as it was only 5 feet from my front door to the balcony wall, it could surely not have been a football. How could anyone have managed that in so narrow a space? It must have been something else. At dawn, I found the courage to glance out, but the first thing I saw, sitting on the deserted walkway outside, was an old football, a red and white Slazenger, the dry leather riddled with cracks. I slammed the door on it and only peeped out again several hours later. By then it had gone. Around lunchtime that day, a man came to see me. He was a huge man, clad in a stiff black suit and wearing black leather gloves. He told me his name was Mr. Balfager, and that he represented the private concern who had won the contract to build the new intersection. His company weren't really happy about waiting for an eviction case, he said, and wondered what the problem was. I felt that honesty was the best course of action. I told him that I thought private enterprise was one of the great ills of the Western world, particularly when it meant playing a numbers game with people's lives, and that if my refusal to see my home crushed into rubble was interfering with their cash flow, then I was sorry, but it was not my prime concern. He seemed to accept that, but warned me in the politest possible terms that the new intersection would be built, whether I liked it or not. That night was the most frightening of my life. It first started about 10 o'clock, when Poppy became agitated. She began to yelp and hid under my coffee table, refusing to come out. Then I heard it. It was very distant, possibly across the courtyard on one of the opposite balconies. It sounded as if someone was rattling the door handle to one of the flats very violently. I tensed. It was a sound anyone who'd grown up in the part of town I had would know well, the sound of a break-in. It could herald anything, from a harmless tramp seeking a roof for the night to a maniac bent on theft and murder. That was when another door began to rattle in a different part of the project. Then another, and another. The door on the empty flat next to mine began to shake as well. I shrank back into my armchair, reaching slowly for the telephone. A second later, it seemed that every door on the project was banging and rattling. The row was deafening, almost like thunder in the very fabric of the building. The floor seemed to vibrate under my feet. I'm terrified by violence and curled up into a helpless ball, hardly daring to look up. But I would not be bullied, I told myself repeatedly. I would not be. Then abruptly it stopped. Silence fell on the estate like thick dust. I listened out for a moment, then hurriedly picked up the phone and called the police. Just as hurriedly, however, I replaced it again. What could I say to them? That an army of burglars had descended and tried to break into every unit, all at the same time? I spent another sleepless night, huddled under my quilt. Poppy was equally restless, constantly trotting to the front door, sniffing around its base and growling, as though there was someone or something just on the other side of it. The next morning, I went round to see Mr. Mulqueeny. Despite his dislike of me, I had to talk to him. I was wondering if I was starting to imagine things, if the sheer faces of empty tower blocks on all sides and the empty wind-blown corridors were starting to take their toll. He didn't answer his door, however. When I looked in through the window, I saw him sitting up, staring directly at me, his face white as milk and fixed in a ghastly expression. His hands had clawed, the fingers sunk into the arms of the chair. I have seen death before. I nursed my mother through 6 years of terminal cancer, so I was not unduly upset by it. Admittedly, his posture was horrifying, but there is no pretty picture of death. Then I saw the faces. All over his window, etched into the dust, were faces, as clear as fingerprints, detail for detail, all twisted horribly, eyes clenched shut, mouths agape, as if shrieking. Dozens and dozens of them, covering every foot of the window, pressed tightly in. That was almost too much for me. I ran back to my own flat. On the way up, I fancied I could hear someone coming after me, great hammering feet which sounded in the echoing stairwell like hooves clopping. I made it safely back, however, and called the police. I didn't go back down to the courtyard until I saw a patrol car pulling in under the archway 10 minutes later. None of the officers were very sympathetic. It was obviously a heart attack, they said, and when they examined the window, they found no imprints of faces, fingers, or in fact anything else. Their final word to me was that it was foolish to hang on in a place like this. It was with a complete and final air of desolation that afternoon that I watched them take the old soldier's body away in a hearse. Then council workmen began to nail his property up. I was alone, apart from Poppy. At least, that was what I thought, until I went back inside and found that she wasn't there anymore. I spent much of the evening roaming about the deserted lots, shouting her name. Not once, though, did a joyful bark or yelp come back to me. Nowhere, among the strewn rubbish or overturned bins, did a small brown spaniel look up, its tongue hanging out and docked tail wagging. I went back to my flat when it got dark. With most of the street lights broken, night came quickly on Marlborough Court, surging in through the archways like the sea. I sat there for hours, feeling sorry for myself. I must have nodded off, however, for it was after midnight when I suddenly jerked awake. At first I wondered what had disturbed me, then I heard it, a faint yipping sound. I leapt to my feet. It was Poppy. I would recognize her anywhere. I listened for a moment and heard her again. Now she sounded agitated. She was obviously trapped somewhere, but where? Minutes passed, and finally I was drawn down onto my hands and knees. The yelping was coming from under my own floorboards, or rather, the empty flat beneath them. I hurried for my coat and shoes and went outside. It occurred to me fleetingly that this might be unwise, but I shrugged it off. I walked along to the top of the first stairwell. It was utterly dark down there, and so quiet you could have had a pin drop. In fact, it was like that all over the estate. Behind me, the courtyard was a virtual abyss. I picked my way down the steps, all the same, turned the corner at the bottom and walked along the balcony. I came to the flat under mine and found that, although corrugated iron had been fitted over the windows, somebody had wrenched the door ajar. It didn't surprise me. I couldn't see any other way for Poppy to have got in. I listened for a minute. Now there was no sound from her. Eventually, softly, I called her name. Still, I heard nothing. She'd either come out again or was so badly hurt that she couldn't move. There was nothing for it. I'd have to go in. I found it musty and damp inside and thought I could hear a dry, rustling sound like old paper. It was too dark to see anything well, and I fumbled my way down the first passage. The floor had been scattered with shells or something. With every step it crunched under my feet. I checked in the first room, but again I couldn't see anything. I was sure that if Poppy had been anywhere in the apartment, I'd have heard her whining or panting by now. The suspicion grew on me that not only was she not there, but that she never had been. That faint rustling noise was still around, but it wasn't like any sound a dog might make. In fact, it was starting to seem familiar to me in an obscure way. I looked in the next room, my feet still crunching on things. It was as if someone had scattered crisps or breakfast cereal all over the place. This room would have been the largest in the flat. I knew this because mine had the same layout. I saw that one of the metal sheets had come loose on the window and that orange lamplight was shafting in onto the carpet. It was a carpet which seemed to be moving. My hair prickled. I looked closer. My crunching footsteps, the dry rustling, all easily explained now, because the floor was swarming with cockroaches. And I mean swarming. They were scuttling all over each other, a twitching, twittering mass of antennae and shiny, chitinous bodies. I remember blundering to the wall, my feet grinding them, sliding in their pulp. I was too sick with horror even to think straight. Now they were running over my feet, back and forth, with horrible speed. I reached out for the mantelpiece, but something jumped onto my hand from it, then scurried up my arm. I swatted it off. Next, something ran up the back of my leg. My response was simply to run. I didn't know where to. I just did, clawing wildly at myself, screams locked in my throat. I skidded and crashed into the window. The loose shutter fell off completely and light flooded the hellhole. A living tide rose about my feet, black and pulsating. There weren't thousands of them, I realized. There were millions. This wasn't infestation. This was a plague. Then one dropped past my face. I looked slowly up. Dear God, they were on the ceiling, twitching and scuttling in the cracks, thickly clustered in the corners, dripping down around me. At one side of the room, the paper had fallen away in strips, and an endless river of them flowed up the wall and through the exposed rafters, under the floorboards of the flat above. My flat. I staggered outside, still screaming silently, violently beating myself to knock the crawling devils off me. Then I was violently ill, all over the walkway. It took me several minutes to recover, but when I did, I had no intention of going back to my flat. Not after that. I couldn't face that. It was hardly fair of them, really. Fighting me that way, knowing all about my mother's little house and the creatures which shared it with us, dashing about under the sink and cooker, under the cupboards and beds, in the wardrobes and drawers. God, not that, never that. And so I set off, there and then, on foot, just walking out of Marlborough Court with only the clothes I was standing up in. I was almost clear of the courtyard when I heard a distant, delighted shouting somewhere behind me, as though from several voices. They were guttural and coarse, and now whooping with glee. I turned and saw flames rising in a huge skip. Figures were standing around it, stoking the blaze. Up above them, on the third balcony, on my balcony, in fact, other shapes were moving back and forth, hurling items down, but setting each one on fire first. My possessions. My furniture, my books, records and clothes, even Poppy's basket, flung down one after another in a burning deluge, crashing noisily onto the bonfire. As it rose higher into the night, the triumphal shouts and screams rose with it. I felt too sick and weary even to say anything, and walked on. I'd passed under the arch, crossed the road, and was halfway through the next set of empty tenements when I finally stopped again. I couldn't be bullied, I told myself. I shouldn't be. It wasn't right. I went back to the road and stared through the archway. I could see firelight leaping on the blank walls and doors of the courtyard. It would have to be the bravest moment of my life. I started to cross. And I never knew where the big vehicle came from. It just seemed to sweep up out of the night, hitting me side on with terrible force, turning me over in midair, then flinging me down again like a broken doll. The road surface was cold and hard against my body. It smelled of oil and dirt. I remember the vehicle coming to a halt somewhere in front of me, its engine chugging, then the feet of the driver as he came and stood beside me. I could see him looking down, not too concerned. It's funny how you can tell that sort of thing from the posture of somebody's feet, from the sort of shoes they wear. These were heeled, pointy-toed boots, all buckles and leather straps. They could have been anyone's boots, I suppose, anyone who was out late and wanted to get home so badly that he wasn't watching the road, but they still looked like the sort of boots which might make a clopping noise in an old concrete stairwell. A moment later they climbed back into the vehicle and drove casually away. Sometimes they let me out of the hospital, though I can't get around very easily on my own. Recently, we went on a day trip in a minibus and drove through the city. It was hot, and we were soon tired and irritable. It's hard to get comfortable at the best of times when you're as incapacitated as I am now, but in those cramped, sticky conditions. It got even worse when we came to the brand-new intersection where Marlborough Court once stood. Only one wall of the flats was still standing, and this was soon to be demolished. Bits of wallpaper were visible on it, and here and there the stumps of metal girders stuck out. I gazed up at it, and was astonished to see Mr. Bill Fager standing on the very top, as if to get an overview of the things he had created. I wouldn't have thought it was possible for anyone to get up there, but he had, and judging by the big grin on his face, what he was seeing made him feel very proud. I look about me, though, and I still think I was right. I didn't want to move, and if only they hadn't forced me to. It's so ironic, with log jams of cars now running into each other from every which way, trailing off down subways or up over the flyovers, meeting head-on in the middle, on the numerous traffic islands and T-junctions, coming in from all directions and levels, the whole thing gridlocked and pumping out noise and pollution all day. Well, now nobody's moving at all.
Supper Time by Robert Eastland. Read by Colin Baker.
That August evening was warm, as Jacques Étoile du Bertillon wandered through the dust-grey woods and sun-dried fields on the outskirts of Paris. In the west, the sun sank into fiery oblivion, and all around him the air twittered with birds and droned with insects. Somewhere off the road, the steady chip-chop of a woodsman at work stopped Jacques in his tracks, and he stood listening with deep interest. The woodsman was too far away, though, he eventually decided, and he continued on his way, his eyes now wide and alert, his nostrils savouring the tang of the forest, pungent wood smoke, fruit, and nuts ripening in the dense fat leaves, sticky pine sap, and the strong, sweet scent of reaped summer grass. It was good to be home again, he thought. He'd travelled far and seen many wondrous things over the last few years, but the dusty green woods, the golden patchwork fields, and the rambling vineyards of the Ile-de-France were still closest to his heart. Of course, it was not his home as such, not any more. Jacques knew perfectly well that he no longer had any real home of his own, and he was now long accustomed to sleeping in derelict barns or curled in the shadowy dingles of the forest. It was all the same to him, though, for now the whole world was his to rove across at will, whenever the whim took him backwards and forwards, with no man to stop him. Jacques snorted and laughed to himself as he thought on this. He'd be a fool who'd dare to try it. Just then he heard the sound of human voices. Wandering across the unpaved road to a wall of stones and twigs, Jacques looked into a farm field he'd first taken as deserted, and saw, perhaps 50 yards away, a man and a boy at work. They were of peasant stock, both unshod and loosely clad in baggy sackcloth shirts and coarsely woven breeches. Yet their mops of blue-black hair were damp with sweat, and their firm brown limbs rippled as they worked cheerily and tirelessly in the evening heat. They were bundling faggots together and hurling them onto a small bonfire, which was smoking thickly in the deep green grass. A woodsman and his boy, thought Jacques, suddenly exquisitely happy at the way they laughed aloud and talked so animatedly together. Then, ever so slowly, a painful memory came back to him. He saw again the icy wastes and heard the howling gales of the tundra. He remembered the snowflakes driven like arrows before the blizzard, the trees bent and split and feathered with frost like knives. He felt his feet again on that wretched path, trampled through the hard crust of frozen snow and littered with the hideous remnants of a once great army. He saw smashed cartwheels, broken lances, cannons upended, bridles and saddles abandoned in the snow, discarded muskets. And everywhere there were men, twisted, stiff of limb and ashen of face, clad in colourless uniforms, limping and staggering headlong into the storm, or falling heavily, blue and dead and rigid as boards. It was 1812. Jacques Étoile du Bertillon and countless others had lain and crawled without warmth or shelter, or even the most elementary medical care, in a tempest from hell, a maelstrom of wind, ice, and cutting snow. A lost legion of men who were only half alive. At times it had seemed like Armageddon itself. Countless days were spent fighting pursuing Cossacks, hand to hand, tooth and nail, bloodily and brutally in the endless snowbound forests. Jacques saw again the weak and sputtering campfires at night, and the ravaged, pitiable Frenchmen strewn around them, their bandaged hands frozen to stocks of muskets or hilts of broken swords, their wounds raw and open, a sorry and meagre rearguard for Bonaparte's grand army. And yet neither the wild Russian horsemen nor the numbing frosts were the worst enemies they had to face. With the full darkness there came wolves, gaunt and voracious from the winter, bounding through the skeletal trees in a mad frenzy of teeth and talons. The men had fought back with bayonets, knives, and cudgels, but the animals were insane with the cold and had stubbornly refused to give ground. Jacques remembered them flung onto fires, yet continuing the battle regardless, blazing from nose to tail. He could see them, bleeding copiously, hacked into shreds, yet attacking, always attacking with relentless savagery. He remembered those of his own party felled, saw them sprawled in the crimson snow, monstrous holes rent in their throats, others dying against trees or down on their knees, mauled beyond recognition. Above all, though, Jacques remembered his own personal clash with the leader of the hellish pack, a lean and sinewy brute with shaggy white hair, serpent eyes, and crocodile teeth. Its claws had been the hooks of an eagle, and as it reared for the kill, it had let forth a blood-curdling howl which might have come from the throat of a deranged man. How the two of them had grappled together that night, the soldier's shabby uniform riven to pieces, the wolf's eyes burning with a cold and chillingly intelligent evil. Jacques felt again the agony of flesh raked from his bones, the reek of fur and blood, the weight of the hairy belly as it pinned him to the crushed ice. But he also recalled jamming his pistol into the back of the creature's throat and blowing the top of its skull clean out of its head. Even then, though, the ordeal had gone on. How long had he lain there, torn asunder, wet and bloody, in the raw, gusting wind, the forest clearing a butcher's yard around him, littered with the debris of battle, the gasps and cries of man and beast alike lost on the screaming wind. How he had survived the remainder of that dim and dreadful journey, Jacques had no idea, though somehow he had, and even today he still bore the livid marks of teeth and claws. All that was now far in the past, however, and Jacques Étoile du Bertillon was content with his lot. He looked again at the two farm workers with their strong, hard bodies. Yes, they were plump and healthy enough. He smacked his jaws, drool running down onto his silver fleece, and rolled his long pink tongue across his sharp, white fangs. His fur-flushed belly rumbled with hunger, and in a single bound he had cleared the wall. It was supper time.
The Lark by Robert Eastland. Read by George Sewell.
The first thing Reggie did that morning was go up to Newgate to watch the hanging. After that, he went to work, making his way downriver from Blackfriars. Initially, the pickings weren't so good. The odd piece of coal, a few rags, a copper nail. It was a damp and misty November day as well, so Reggie's bare feet were blue and numb by the time he got to Bermondsey. Lunchtime came, and he ate his bread and whelks under the shelter of a timber wharf, then set off over the mudflats again, on some occasions plunging to his knees in the pungent slime, on others using rubble and bits of driftwood as stepping stones. It was almost dark by the time he reached Greenwich, and the deep pockets in his ragged old jacket and trousers were still largely empty. Other young-uns could expect to go home and get a leather in for that, not Reggie. Reggie was good mates with his father. They were two of a kind. He was just moving inshore again, the water level rising behind him, when he noticed something sticking up out of the mud. It was curved and yellowish, and looked smooth like porcelain. Reggie bent over quickly and dug it out. It was only about the size of his head, but quite heavy because it was hollow and full of silt. Reggie rubbed it clean on his jacket sleeve. then hooked his fingers inside to clean it out. It was a human skull, the top half of one at least. Reggie had thought it would be. It didn't upset him. He may only have been 9 years old, but he'd already seen terrible sights on the Thames water edge. Worse than this. He was just wondering how much it might be worth when an exciting thought struck him. He looked around. He was standing on a narrow, sloping beach which ran up to a high dock wall, and beyond that the massive shape of the East India Company warehouses. To either side of him were landing stages for the shipyards. There was nothing to indicate whether or not this was the spot where Greenwich Bridge had been, back in the olden days. But if it was, well, this could prove to be a real find. Reggie put it safely under his jacket, then scampered up the dock steps and ran for his life through the squalid alleyways bordering on the river. His old man was a coal packer by trade, and he had just come home when the lad got there. Home being 2 rooms, one on top of the other, at the back of a row of charity shops. "So, what about this?" said Reggie, breathless with excitement, holding up the skull. The man looked at it dubiously as he took off his smock and neckerchief, both filthy with coal dust. "What you got there, Reg? Bit of old bone, isn't it?" "I reckon it's the old Archbishop's skull, Dad," said Reggie. "You remember, the one the minister told us about down at the mission school. They reckon he got clobbered on the footbridge ages back by these Viking blokes, walloped to death with a cow's head. We had a lark over that, remember? A cow's head." The true tale of Archbishop Althea, murdered in bizarre fashion by the pagans almost 1,000 years before, was a well-known one. Everyone brought up in that part of London had heard it. A look of understanding came slowly over the man's ruddy, bristling face. "That I do, Reggie, yeah. A cow's head. They gave him a good old walloping with it, then threw him into the river, remember?" the boy went on. "Well, I bet this is his skull, or what's left of him. What do you reckon it'll fetch, Dad?" The man rubbed his chin with a big calloused hand. "A bob or two, I should think, Reggie," he grinned, showing a row of brown teeth. "A bob or two, right enough." "We'll have a lark then, eh, Dad?" His father slapped him on the back. "That we will, Reggie. We'll take it to the museum first thing tomorrow." The streets of Greenwich were seldom quiet. During the day they teemed with folk out on business, then at night with the gin houses, then again from the crack of dawn with barrows being readied for market, and dockers and pearlmen cramming down to the yards. Only between 2 and 4 did total silence fall. Reggie and his father were both bedded down under their thin, patched-up quilt around that time. This night in particular, though, the boy couldn't sleep. It was icy cold outside, and a thick fog was rolling up the alleys from the river. Reggie could see it through the slatted shutters, swirling sluggishly. He ignored it. November was the time for pea-soupers. Then he heard something. At first, he thought it was just some rat or mouse, and tried to put it out of his mind. But the noise continued, becoming more insistent. The boy began to listen. It was a faint rattle coming from below, like somebody fiddling quietly with the latch at the door. First, Reggie was amazed. What could some burglar want to come and break into a hovel like this for? He and his father didn't have anything worth stealing. Apart from the skull. Reggie sat bolt upright in bed. Of course, the skull! Happened some other river finder had seen him pick it up and wanted it for himself. Nimble as a monkey, the boy scrambled down the ladder from the loft and snatched the skull off the hearthstone where he'd left it earlier. The flagged floor was horribly cold on his bare feet compared to the floorboards upstairs. In fact, a biting chill had filled the whole room. The fiddling with the door had stopped as well. Reggie held his breath. He imagined somebody listening on the other side. That was when he noticed the strange smell, sort of sweet and smoky, like the incense they sometimes burned in church. And he heard another noise, a different one from before. It was like a scratching, as if someone was running sharp fingernails over rough wood. Reggie looked hard at the door. The noise was coming from the other side, and it was getting louder. Soon it sounded as if whoever it was drawing those sharp fingernails from the very top of the door to the very bottom. Sharp fingernails, or long, bony fingers. Reggie was up into the loft like a shot, pulling the ladder up behind him. When he got there, he found that his father had lit a stub of candle and was now peering at him white-faced over the old grey quilt. "What is it, son?" the man asked in a whisper. Reggie dived into the bed beside him. "Dunno," he said. but I reckon someone's come to take this skull back off us." Reggie's old man had never been particularly bright or brave. "Lord help us, Reggie," he hissed. "You don't think it's him, do you? The Archbishop? Come back for his head?" Reggie said that he didn't know. He was now a quaking heap under the quilt. A minute later, when the scratching and clawing began on the bedroom shutters, his father joined him there. "How can this be, Reg? That window must be 12 feet off the ground, and it's just a sheer wall, no footholds." "I don't reckon dead archbishops need no footholds, Dad," said the boy, his eyes screwed shut, the skull hugged tightly to his chest. The mysterious scratchings and rappings continued for another hour or so, frightening them both badly. At one point, when they fancied they could hear things moving about in the room below, Reggie's father whispered that he fair felt his heart was going. It didn't, though. By the time horses and carts were abroad in the streets again, the noises had ceased, leaving both father and son ashen and shivering. Reggie thought it best they set off for the museum in double-quick time, before the Archbishop came back again. They put the skull in a small wooden box and made their way across London on foot. But it was early afternoon by the time they got to Bloomsbury. For late autumn, it was a nice, bright day, and lots of ladies and gents were walking about arm in arm at the front of the magnificent buildings, all snug in their shawls and frock coats. Reggie and his father watched them from the corner of Great Russell Street. Neither of them were quite sure how to go about this, so they decided just to chance it and walk in through the big doors at the front. As soon as they got past the gates and the railings, though, a peeler stopped them. He was a gigantic bloke with a line of shiny buttons on the front of his black tunic and a tall stovepipe hat on his massive head. Mutton-chop whiskers ran down the sides of his hard brown face, which he was using to scowl at them in a most menacing manner. "Come on, then. Let's be having you," he said sternly, pointing back at the gates with his staff. Outside the railings again, Reggie's father wondered if they ought to tell the peeler about the skull, but his son was adamant that they shouldn't. "The beak won't know about the Archbishop, will he? He'll think it's someone we've gone and topped. He'll have us up for the next dropping." His father slapped a hand to his forehead. "Gold, Reggie! You ain't half a bright lad. I'd never have thought of that." There was nothing else for it, so they set off back, but by mid-afternoon had only reached Rotherhithe. By then, both were getting tired, so they hitched a ride on the back of a rubbish cart, but almost immediately the driver, a big, red-faced man in leather apron and fantail hat, pitched them off, calling them good-for-nothing scoundrels and threatening them with his whip. Then he got curious and asked them what was in the box. "Somebody's head, no doubt," he shouted, unfurling his whip again and saying he was going to make them pay for their foul, murdering ways. They both ran, ducking down an alley. The man didn't follow, and a few minutes later they slowed to a walk again. Perhaps the bloke had been mad. He'd certainly acted that way. As Reggie's father remarked, wasn't it odd the way he'd come over all queer the moment he'd laid eyes on the box? By the time they reached Deptford, another grey-yellow fog was rolling in, and soon the narrow courts were taking on a more sinister aspect. The odd person who passed them was a hooded, muffled spectre hurrying on his or her way. The gaslights at the junctions between alleys gave off only a faint, luminous glow, and that was only when you were close to them. They crossed several busy thoroughfares, but always pressed on into more cramped byways between tall, silent buildings. It was amazing how quickly they could leave the clatter and crash of traffic behind them. The fog was like a sodden blanket thrown over everything. It deadened all sound, except for one in particular, a damp, rustling sound, like wet cloth being dragged over rough flagstones. Eventually, father and son both stopped to listen to it. They'd been hearing it for several minutes before they'd plucked up the courage to admit that it was there. Worried glances passed between them as it drew steadily nearer. Reggie glanced back behind. Nothing was visible, the black brick walls on either side quickly vanishing into the murk. The boy imagined it was the sort of sound an archbishop's vestments might make, especially if they were all torn and covered in mud. Suddenly, there was a smell of incense in the air. Reggie and his father began to run, blundering along the passage, turning sharp corners with reckless speed, hands outstretched in front of them. Even through the echo of their footfalls and the beating of blood in their ears, they could still hear the sound of that rancid cloth swishing over the paving stones behind them. They were now alongside a stream. It was foul and cluttered with refuse, and up ahead, crossed by a bridge with lights upon it. Reggie urged his father along. A bridge meant a proper road, and that meant people. Surely there'd be steps leading up to it. But there weren't. When they reached the bridge, they found that the path ran off under its arch, dwindling into utter blackness. Above them, hooves and wheels were clashing, and the voices of newspaper sellers and costermongers calling out. But that was all 10 feet away. 10 feet of sheer bricks. Reggie and his father gazed at each other in horrified disbelief. Then they heard the approaching drag of rotted vestments again, and were suddenly swamped in incense. "Quick!" Reggie shrieked. "The Archbishop!" His father needed no second telling, and was soon hauling himself up the wall. It was old and loose, and afforded many hand and footholds. Before Reggie followed, he took the skull from the box and placed it in his pocket. Its empty sockets looked accusingly at him as he did, but he wasn't in the mood to relinquish his treasure yet. What about that lark him and his father were going to have with all the money? And he noticed a figure gliding up out of the fog behind him. He knew it was gliding because from the corner of his eye he could see no motion of legs. Reggie went up the wall hand over hand, not daring to look behind him. An icy breeze caressed the back of his neck, and the smell of incense was overpowering. Now, with another smell mixed in, something vile and corrupted. A second later, though, he was over the parapet and into the traffic with his father. This time they made sure they kept to the crowded ways and walked home quickly, soaked with sweat and continually glancing over their shoulders. When they finally got there, after barring all the doors and windows and lighting as many bits of candles as they could find, Reggie and his father had their first cross words in many a month. It was about the skull and what they were going to do with it. The boy said it was their best chance ever, but the man reckoned they'd never be doing much larking about with an archbishop's ghost on their tails all the time, and now it was obvious that it wouldn't be easy selling the skull. Who was to say they hadn't just dug it up from some graveyard? They could even get flogged for it. It was high time they gave the poor old sod his head back. They argued for an hour before Reggie's father finally unbuckled his belt and ordered his son to take the thing back to the river. He had better things to do with the rest of his life, he said, than spend it worrying about headless clergymen. Reluctantly, Reggie set off. It was now dark as well as foggy, and for Greenwich, unusually quiet. The boy wasn't as scared now, though. He couldn't see the Archbishop interfering with him when he was taking the skull back. He made his way through the dockland streets to the river and listened to it for a moment, lapping gently in its dirty shroud of fog, before clambering down the wall and picking his way over the rubbish and pebbles. He wasn't sure exactly where he dug the skull up, but here seemed as good a place. He looked at it one more time and felt as if he was about to throw away a wad of £5 notes. He didn't notice the figure shuffling along the beach, even when it came and stood beside him. "Please forgive me for having disturbed you, Mr. Archbishop," said the boy, in the tone they'd taught him to pray in at the mission school. "Honest, I'm sorry for it, but please don't keep haunting us. I know you must have been a good bloke, because otherwise you'd never have been a bishop. So please let me and my father off the hook. Make it worth my while putting you back, eh?" Then he sensed the figure beside him. He turned sharply. It had no head. Reggie's father had been stretched out in his bed for half an hour when he heard the first step on the ladder below. He sat up quickly. "That you, Reg?" For some reason he didn't think it was. Fear grew on him quickly. The next thing he knew, a shape was ascending through the trap door. A big shape, in voluminous robes. They were covered in bright picture patterns, but were hanging in rags and stained with black river mud. Slowly, Reggie's father drew the quilt up to his chin. The thing didn't actually seem to climb, it just rose, right up through the trap, until it was standing there in the loft, with his back to him. "Reggie, please come home, son," the man whimpered, and it turned swiftly to look at him. Suddenly, Reggie's father couldn't breathe. It came slowly across the room, but it didn't walk. It glided. By the time it reached his bed, he could see it clearly. His first reaction, before mind-numbing horror set in, was surprise, because he'd expected that it wouldn't have a head, but it did. No human head, though. As it leaned over and looked him squarely in the eye, Reggie's father saw that what passed for the spectre's head was the skull of a cow. The headless man on the riverbank had turned out to be old Cokie Farley, an aged scavenger well known to the rest of the mudlarks. He was a short, stumpy man who walked with a stoop and dressed in a heavy cloak with a hood, which explained his ghastly appearance in the dark. He stood beside Reggie and looked down at the skull as the boy related everything which had happened to them. When Reggie had finished, the old-timer shook his grizzled, toothless head. "I know nothing about bishops and whatnot, son, but this here skull ain't no older than 2 or 3 years, see?" He rapped his knuckles against it. "It's in good nick. Old bones fall to bits. That wasn't your bishop's head. Probably someone else's." Reggie was baffled. "Who?" Cokie shrugged. "Lots of strange things happen on this river. Lots of blokes end up in it. Best place for most of them." Reggie felt a thrill of concern. "Why?" Cokie cackled. "You know as well as I do. Some real old villain's gone to a watery grave along here." Reggie felt panic growing inside him. "But what about the ghost and all?" Cokie examined the skull more closely. "If you've gone and woken up some old spirit, it don't have to have been the bishop's, does it? Probably pretending to be, just to have a joke on you, eh? Who's to say ghosts don't like a bit of a lark? Besides, you think some saintly old bishop would do a thing like this? No chance. This'll be some real nasty piece of work." Reggie wasn't listening anymore, however. He was herring up the beach. He made it home as fast as he could. When he entered, found both rooms in darkness. Downstairs was ice cold, and there was a faint smell of incense. The boy called his father from the door, but receiving no reply, made his way hesitantly towards the ladder. After a moment, he began to climb it. The loft was equally black and silent. Reggie knew that if he fumbled about on the shelf near the bed, he'd find a spare candle and tinderbox. He couldn't believe how cold it was, though. It was certainly colder in the house than out in the street. At last, he managed to strike a light and looked quickly about him. The tiny room was empty, however. Reggie started violently and whirled around. A cow? A cow lowing? And inside the loft? Now he was terrified. He stared round in the flickering candlelight, and finally his eyes came to rest on the threadbare curtain covering the closet and the pea pot. It had come from behind there. But how? His grubby hand shaking, and moist with sweat, Reggie reached out, took hold of the drape, and yanked it aside. His father was sitting there, on the pot, but his pants were still buckled. He looked up at Reggie and grinned with bovine contentedness. "No," he said again. Then he began to laugh.
Mummy's Boy by Robert Eastland, read by Leslie Grantham.
When I looked over the big back gates, I could not believe what I was seeing. I almost swooned, in fact. When I had moved away from Highbury some 2 years ago, this had been a tall, semi-detached townhouse, but now they had changed it. They had changed it all. It was built on a slope, so while the front door opened onto the street, the back door had been at the top of a flight of wrought iron stairs, which had dropped nearly 10 feet to a strip of lawn and a cobbled drive connecting to the residents-only access road. The garage had been on that level, integral to the house, but located beneath everything else. That was how it had been, as I say, and now they had changed it all. The cobbled drive had been turfed over, and where the garage had once been, a new extension had been built. The back door was now on ground level, and through a wide, fashionably mullioned window, I could see that a kitchen occupied the spot where I'd once housed my car. I couldn't imagine what Brenda was going to say. I was so shaken, in fact, that at first I didn't notice the young woman approaching tentatively along the access road. When I did see her, I apologised and stepped back. She was carrying shopping bags, and apparently it was this particular pair of gates she wanted to pass through. She looked warily at me as she shut the gates behind her. Suddenly there was a light of recognition in her face. Aren't you... Yes, I said awkwardly. I sold you the house 2 years ago. She half smiled, and we stood in difficult silence for a moment. Eventually she asked if I was all right. She said I looked a little pale. I assured her I was fine, but wondered when they had had the extension put in. Oh, it's not been finished long, she said brightly. In fact, the last skipful of rubble was only removed yesterday. She paused uncertainly. I take it you don't approve. Oh, no, I said. No, it's nice. How far back does it go? Into the garage, I mean. Oh, we've taken up the whole garage, she said. We've completely redeveloped. Even had to tear some of the old foundation walls out. Indeed. I could feel my legs shaking, could sense the colour draining out of my face. Again, she asked me if I was all right. I looked up at her. She was quite attractive in a plum-voiced, well-heeled sort of way. For a moment, I wondered what it would be like knocking her out, then wrapping her up like a parcel in sticking plaster and limp bandages. Do you know, it's the oddest thing, she suddenly declared. I waited tensely. You might be able to explain it. We found an old wardrobe bricked up in one of the garage walls. I tried to say something but couldn't. All bricked over, she went on. At first we thought it had been there for years, but our builder said it hadn't. There was nothing in it, of course. Nothing in it. Hard though I tried, I couldn't keep the shock out of my voice, and she jumped violently. No, she said, a little shaken. Of course it was lying in the rubble for a few days before we actually got round to looking in it. We'd moved out for a week, you see. I nodded and smiled, my mind racing ahead of me. What? I shrugged and made some meaningless gesture. Oh, what an odd thing. A wardrobe. So what did you do with it? She looked thoughtful. Do you know, it was still quite solid, so I think we gave it to the Stoke Newington Mothers' Union, of all the ridiculous things. I looked at her askance. Stoke Newington's Mothers' Union. She nodded, for a raffle. Unable to help myself, I howled with laughter. I howled with laughter all the way back along the access road, as the woman stared after me, astonished. That was just so neat. I couldn't have scripted it better. I was still chuckling by the time I reached the tube station, but now more with hysteria than mirth. I couldn't even stop my hands shaking. For one thing, what the hell had happened to the contents of the wardrobe? For another, what was Brenda going to say when she found out that I'd been back over there again? I could hear her nagging even then as I checked my underground travel card and walked down to the platforms. Why do you keep going back, she'd be saying over her fourth Pims. Can't you forget her, for God's sake? You're supposed to be a grown man now. Do you want to get us both locked up? As I stood alone on the southbound platform, I wondered at the answers to those questions myself. It was certainly a hard one. But then, when two women insist on making it one or the other, what can you do? And when one treats you to one of her famous long, cold silences, then when she finally does speak, threatens to cut you off without a penny, and you haven't a skill to your name, and the other might not be able to cook very well or do the ironing to military camp precision, but is still blonde and bosomy and a heck of a lot younger, well, it's still not an easy decision, though. Little wonder I hadn't actually been able to do the dirty. No, I'd never have been able to bring myself to do that. Of course, what I had resorted to had more or less added up to the same thing. I'd thought. I wondered again about the wardrobe lying open and empty in the demolition rubbish. It made me a little uneasy. The arched tunnels at either end of the curved platform were filled with darkness, and not another soul was in sight. In addition to this, it seemed eerily quiet for an underground station in mid-morning. That was when I first heard the rustling sound. I listened to it intently for a moment, and then sniggered. Just for a second then I'd imagined, but no, probably just old newspapers blowing about in an air vent. It wasn't going away, however, that rustling sound. In fact, it seemed to be getting louder, and it didn't sound much like paper either, more like rags or bandages. Stiff, stinking, rotted bandages. I tried to tell myself this was foolish, but glanced nervously behind me all the same. The exit passage swung out of sight, but I knew that at the far end of it, steep stairs ran up to the higher levels, and I could have sworn that the rustling sound, or whatever was causing it, was shuffling painfully down that way, towards my platform. Absurdly, I began to back away. All of a sudden, the sound seemed intolerably loud, and it was getting louder, without any doubt. At any second, I expected the sound maker to stumble into view, turning blindly and limping straight towards me. It was nonsense, I told myself, still retreating. It would be some bag lady. That would explain the smell too. The sour, cloying smell now wafting about me. I looked wildly around for someone, but nobody was there. Hanging in a metal box over the lines was a glowing red message. The next train, Brixton, 4 minutes. 4 minutes? That was no good. That was no good at all. I began to stride down the platform as quickly as I was able, determined not to run. But I felt, rather than saw, the spindly figure emerge behind me, and then I couldn't help it. I started to sprint, headlong. Fleeting thoughts struck me about what I would do when I reached the end, and did I dare venture into the tunnel the way they did on films, when mercifully another exit materialized beside me, and I ducked quickly through it, staggering up a narrow stair into a crossroads of tunnels, where suddenly there were numerous other people about. I re-emerged on Canterbury Road only seconds later, my brow beaded with sweat. I walked unsteadily away for another 3 or 4 minutes before stopping to get my thoughts in order. It was the shock of seeing the house, of course. Delayed shock. I began to walk on again. Easy to explain. That was when I became aware that someone was stalking me. For 50 yards along the pavement, plywood hoardings had been nailed up to wall off an area of rubble and rebuilding. The narrowest gaps were visible between each section, and it was through these that I suddenly noticed a figure keeping abreast of me. I couldn't make it out, but with each gap I passed, a shadow flickered by on the other side. There was also that rather unpleasant odour as well. I halted in my tracks and listened. Only the raucous sounds of the London streets came back to me. In such a cacophony of noise, it was almost impossible to hear anything out of the ordinary. But I could have sworn that something was on the other side of the hoarding from me, not moving. I started, then hurriedly crossed the road and hailed a black cab. I climbed into it immediately and ordered the driver to take me to Little Venice. I didn't specify the address. Benefiting from the sale of an unmortgaged house in central London teaches you to be cautious like that. The cab pulled quickly away from the curb, and I gazed out of the window behind us, hoping to catch some glimpse of the thing which had followed me. The hoardings continued to the next corner, and just as we drew away from it, I saw an old man in a shabby raincoat emerge. He was zipping up his flies. I sat back, still sweating hard. It hadn't made me feel any better. Countless minutes passed as I wrestled my ridiculous fears. How was I going to explain all this to Brenda? I just didn't know. Even if she did believe me, and didn't insist I'd been off mooning about and daydreaming again, she'd probably drag me by the collar back to every place I imagined I'd been frightened in, and insist on proving to me there was nothing there. I wasn't sure if I could face that. That was when I noticed something peculiar about the cabbie. Everything had at first appeared normal. The meter was running, a copy of The Sun was folded on the dashboard, but he hadn't once looked round or spoken. He wore a heavy overcoat as well, a thick, heavy overcoat on a hot summer day. Too mesmerized to exercise caution, I craned my neck forwards to look at the hands clamped on the steering wheel. They were swathed in ragged, dirty stuff, every finger separately wrapped. I left my seat with such force that the cab's door literally exploded open in front of me. Before I knew what was happening, I was staggering away across some parkland, then down a side street. I'd just had time to hear angry shouting in a bass Cockney voice somewhere behind me, but I must have covered half a mile before it began to dawn on me that the cabbie had in fact been wearing dirty woolen mittens, probably serving as driving gloves. Red-faced and feeling extremely guilty, I made the rest of the way to Little Venice on foot. It was lunchtime by the time I reached the flat, and despite the terrors of the morning, a real hunger had come over me. It was rapture to finally get inside and lock the door behind me, and then be assailed by delicious smells from the kitchen. I could hear Brenda working in there, and hurried through, stripping off my jacket and telling her how hungry I was. I still wasn't sure how to broach the subject of the wardrobe, but safe in my castle again, I was certain I'd think of something. I was so preoccupied with this that I didn't immediately notice the object propped up in the corner of the closet. I was just in the process of hanging up my jacket when I saw it. My jaw locked open. It was essentially a human figure, but plastered from head to foot in bandages, now yellow and black and hanging down in tattered strips. A charnel reek came off it, and vermin visibly writhed in its loose and rotten folds. It did not move, however, and was plumper than I'd expected it to be. In fact, it was rather shapely. Then I noticed the fresh crimson stains soaked in over the facial area, and the strands of long blonde hair straggling down from the hastily wrapped head. I backed slowly away and found myself falling into a seat by the kitchen table. My lunch had already been cooked and was waiting there for me. No TV dinner today, however, but 4 rashers of bacon, Cumberland sausage, 2 fried eggs and a heap of crisp golden chips. My favourite lunchtime meal, apparently done to a turn. The eggs were just the way I'd always liked them too, sunny side up. In fact, the only thing missing was vinegar. I couldn't have chips without vinegar. As though sensing my disappointment, somebody came up and banged down a bottle of vinegar next to the plate. It hit the tabletop so hard that some of the fluid spat out of the nozzle and hit me in the eye, stinging badly. I wiped it out, but said nothing. It looked like I was in for another of those long, cold silences, I thought, as I tucked in.